Okay, ladies and gentlemen. So, yeah, again, it's another... I don't think we've ever done 2 straight shows where I'm just skipping the intro and getting right into it, but today it is, again, worth it because we have back with us today Jack Hirsch. Jack, thank you so much for coming back on to Newsflash.
How's it going? Thanks so much for having me again.
It's going very, very well. How are you doing, Jack? Doing good? Starting the new year off right, hopefully?
Yeah. Just doing classes, going to the gym,
Very very important things to do. Very, very important things to do. Yeah, so a lot of important stuff to talk about here today, and very, very good to have you here to do it. And we got to start with the latest stuff. Jack, there has been an attack on America. I don't know. Yeah, have you heard, Jack, at all? It's pretty serious.
Heard.
Yeah. So 3 troops. We talked about it last time. 3 troops have been killed in Jordan. Obviously, a pretty sad situation, a pretty dangerous situation as well. So far it seems we have the latest in here. This is I'm in London right now, so I got to go with the BBC. But this is from BBC News from the New York correspondent there. They say President Joe Biden has decided on how the U.S. will respond to a drone strike that has killed 3 American troops in Jordan at the weekend. They're right. So Biden did not elaborate on his remarks at the White House, but added, "I don't think we need a wider war in the Middle East," which is very encouraging. It's good to hear him say, I agree. But anyway, So an Iran-backed militia obviously claimed responsibility for the attack at the U.S. military base. Dozens were injured in Sunday's strike near the Syrian border. So it's going to be a pretty. So apparently, he just asked, Mr. President, do you know how will you respond to the strike? Have you decided yet? And then apparently, he just in traditional, Biden fashion, we've seen it all before, just kind of blurts out, yes, I have. So yeah, what was your reaction, Jack, to this news coming over the wire through the past few days, and what do you think of this news that now a response from the U.S. is imminent?
Well, it's interesting. I hadn't heard about Biden's response. Honestly, it's things on his side haven't been looking great. His response, especially to domestic affairs with what's happening at the border, I mean, it's such a weak response from him. So not expecting too much from Biden at this time, but I mean, I think, we probably do have to respond, but also trying to avoid this wider war. Hopefully that is something that is just out of the picture, but it's becoming more and more of a reality every day. But I mean, there's a lot of different moving parts now, a lot of different parties with the Houthis and with Iran and all these different groups, Iranian-backed groups, and so I mean it's a lot to deal with, and I honestly don't know what the best course of action would be from the U.S. at this point. I mean, I'm wondering what you think about that.
Yeah. I think it's going to be very, very tough. Especially for someone like Biden, who is in such a tough position as it is at the moment. And so many people do. I think it would be helpful to him, kind of back home politically, in terms of just looking like he's got a handle on things, which is probably one of his biggest political, negatives, is the fact that he just does not seem to have just a basic handle on what's going on in the country. I feel like, in his age and his, the frequent videos of him kind of just his brain short circuiting definitely does not help with that, to be very clear. But I feel like it is a very kind of tough situation for him. And I think he does have the opportunity to do something very smart, but it wouldn't be necessarily, what you think. I'd say it's like you do your kind of face-saving response. You hit a few of these Iranian-backed militia positions. Apparently the attack, came over from Syrian territory. So, just hit, a few of these, positions in Syria. But then, because they said in their, responsibility statement for this attack that this was done, in response to the U.S. conduct in relation to Israel, and the same thing with the Houthis, we're kind of seeing this kind of common problem here, is you actually take a step to, just communicate to these actors that we are, and there's something that, the Republicans may call him weak for it or something, but I think it would be very effective if he framed this in the kind of concept of trying to avoid a regional war, which is something that I think a lot of people are suspect and say, hey, what? We are not the biggest fans of Benjamin Netanyahu. I think that's pretty broadly, understood in the country. Throughout the United States, it's a pretty popular political position. We are going to take steps to rein in Benjamin Netanyahu. We are going to make sure that there is, stopping to the carnage in Gaza. And we're going to try to elevate some of and we're going to try to, force a deal to A, bring the hostages home, and B, stop the carnage in Gaza, and then, actually intervene in a way that the U.S., everyone knows, the U.S. is perfectly capable of doing in the region. So I feel like that, would go a long way in terms of actually, addressing the problem, because, more strikes in this kind of continued escalatory response, as I'm sure you're aware, could lead to some pretty dangerous situations that really no side, or at least not all sides would really want to see a regional war. I definitely think the United States and Iran both would definitely not want to see a regional war, so it would be a good thing to avoid.
Yeah, I think it feeds into that what we talked about last time with the cycle of violence and how it has to be cut off at some point, and the option of just responding to things like this with just a extremely a much larger out of proportion response never leads anywhere. It never does anything good. So I don't think that's the right option. But in terms of the Houthi attacks, especially on non-military targets, on ships that are not specific to Israeli ships, stuff like this, stopping world commerce, I don't think this is an effective method, capturing random innocent people. I disagree with that method, but yeah, I mean, at a certain point, the retaliation response can't be this escalated response, and that's just been the theme with Israel-Palestine as well. Israel can't keep responding at a certain point, it can't keep responding with these out of proportion responses, because with their power, after this war, the world will watch what they do and how they react. But yeah.
Yeah, I feel like it definitely is a really dangerous time, because obviously, we're seeing these comments, and we'll get to it a little bit later in the show today, about how, a lot of people in Israel say it's not a matter of if, it's not a matter of if, but it's a matter of when there is a second front open up in Lebanon, with the Israelis. So I think that shows, I think, in quite well, where they're at in terms of, the regional war. But if the U.S. kind of being Israel's sponsor in a big way, they have this responsibility to, step back. And it's a tough situation, obviously, for Biden to be in. He's definitely not someone who's, really well equipped, shall we say, to handle this situation. But, he's a president. He's trying to run to be president again, and at least get some of his aides on this to realize that this is a very serious situation, and the United States, as somebody who does have some pretty significant influence in the region, and kind of in some ways through Israel, and some definitely a lot of other ways, the fact that we have tons and tons of troops even still in the region, is definitely something that we can act, I think, to take broader steps. And it just as you said, the cycle of violence, we can't expect, and we're not as powerful as a country as we once were, where we could just bomb people to smithereens and just get exactly what we want. A, that's an incredibly amoral, disgusting thing to do, and B, we are just not at that point. Even in Iraq, when we try that in Iraq, we just get just bogged down in a quagmire, and we get really just nothing good coming from it. So I feel like with that knowledge, I think it's really is, the U.S.'s responsibility to come in and say, we have this, we're going to do our kind of face-saving response, but then we're going to move on, and we're going to try and rein in, the Benjamin Netanyahu administration.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think we've seen recently Netanyahu sort of saying, we appreciate you, America, for being our friend, but it seems like they might be going off on their own here with the sort of conflict that's brewing. Yeah, and I've also seen that they're closer than ever to a war with Hezbollah in Lebanon. Mm-hmm. So yeah, things aren't looking too great there, but I'm more hopeful definitely about the US's response now. But yeah, uh,
Yeah, I feel like
yeah.
yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I do think it's important to stand up to Netanyahu because America and Israel don't share these same interests, and you know
Yeah.
we know that. Yeah.
I feel like yeah, it's a very interesting point that I came across in preparation for a recent show that we were doing. Was that this is really the first time that we have U.S. troops dying for explicitly Israeli interests, dying to, in response to someone attacking us because of what Israel is doing. And I think that is something that, not just Biden, but we as a nation have to ask ourselves, are we really going to, be putting troops in harm's way, A, in a country that, we don't really have anything to do with, not that we really ever did in Iraq, and B, we're putting them in there and they're being attacked because of our support for what Israel's doing in the region, which I think is just such a crazy, crazy situation. But another kind of crazy situation that we see developing here, this was caught by a reporter, Ken Klippenstein. It's not really well known, but I think it really should be. But this is a report that essentially he caught from the White House. They have to, under the War Powers Act, they have to send to Congress just the activities of what U.S. troops are doing, and that is kind of public, but it's not really looked at by many people. But in the most recent report that filed on December the 7th, they say a small number of United States military personnel are deployed to Yemen to conduct operations against Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and ISIS. They said this on December 7th. So this is troops in Yemen, but apparently according to this White House report, it's for Al-Qaeda, which is a very interesting situation. So, and of course now the Pentagon is saying that they're, just today has said that there are no troops in Yemen at the moment, which certainly raises the question because, Al-Qaeda, and especially Al-Qaeda, but definitely ISIS, have been subdued for quite a long time.
Right.
And when they were active, they were never really active in Yemen, which, for those of you who don't know really the geography of the Middle East, it's very, down south. It's not really near the kind of area in Syria and Iraq where the ISIS and Al-Qaeda and those terror groups were really operating. But what is your reaction to this news here that there is, apparently there may be a limited number of troops in Yemen, and this, I feel like could be another one of these dangerous situations.
Yeah. So I haven't heard about that. So that's from last month, you're saying?
Well, originally, this reporter, I think he found the story. The report was filed last month. He found the report recently and then clarified with the Pentagon, who said that there were, in turn, no troops in the U.S., even though the report, which is from December 7th, said that there was troops.
Right. Yeah, I mean, well, the U.S. we have bases in Yemen, don't we? There's people stationed there?
I do not entirely believe so, just because we are backing the Saudis' campaign against the Houthis in Yemen for a long time, and I think we have troops in Bahrain, which is on that, in Qatar and all that stuff. But I don't think we specifically have had troops in Yemen in the past.
Yeah, that, I mean, it would surprise me a lot. I just feel like, I mean, especially what you see a lot with the Middle Eastern politics is the U.S. being totally, everyone's totally traumatized from the war on terror, as we should be. It's just not a good it's not a good response to these kind of things. And something like that would not be promising because that, it just sounds like we're moving backwards again. So.
Yeah. It kind of makes me think of, just the analysis that I was seeing, I really felt like was the case, and a lot of other people seem to, be saying as well, just based on the fact that we had this, U.S. backed, backing the Saudis going into Yemen and doing all these strikes for the past few years and not being, relatively, unsuccessful. And, that the fact that we can't really make a dent on the Houthis unless we go in terms of a, ground invasion. I don't think that is definitely in the cards whatsoever. At least I hope not. But, yeah, I definitely agree with you. It could go down a very, very dangerous road. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. From America's perspective, this stuff doesn't make sense. From the Israeli perspective, a lot of these groups, though, are posing now a pretty tremendous security risk, which is my concern with the stuff that's going on there. Like between the Houthis and Iran, it's not just Hamas. There's so many different factions at play, which do pose a real risk to Israel. So, I mean, Israel, it's expected that they'll be responding to a lot of these other factions and stuff.
Yeah, and I feel like
especially in the broad region. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like there really is an interest for Israel here to take this moment when Biden seems to be just willing to do anything that the Israeli government kind of wants. Do you think there is? Do you kind of agree with me on this assessment that there is this kind of motivation for them to come in and drag the U.S. in and then just help them, wipe out all their enemies in the region in some sort of broader regional war?
A motivation for Israel to draw the U.S. in?
Yes. So it's just like if, for example, say they get involved in a fight, a two-front fight. The U.S. will have to help them more, draw them in. Maybe there'd be some supportive U.S.
Right.
troops even on the ground, And Israel, meanwhile, is sitting there happy as a clam because they got the most powerful military in the world to come in there and just wipe out all their regional enemies, meanwhile facing no consequences for what they're doing in Gaza.
Yeah. I think in a regional war, I mean, Israel and the U. I think the U.S. I think they should back Israel in a regional war such as that. It's just in their interests internationally, and I mean these groups unfortunately they're not going anywhere. The radicalization is continued with a lot of these extremist groups, and in an event where a war starts, I mean I think it would be important to defend against them.
Yeah, now I feel like, but broadly, I think you would agree. It's important to try, from the U.S.'s perspective, despite the fact that Israel, I think, clearly wants a war, with Lebanon in order for that purpose. Yeah. It's important from the U.S.'s perspective to, as we're talking about, step in, kind of cut the head off the Netanyahu snake, force Israel to make at least some really significant changes before this gets into the point where, but obviously it almost feels, ridiculous to talk about because it's not going to happen. But, it feels like they are going to, of course we're going to support them, but I feel like, it is going to a point where it's going to be incredibly damaging, not just for the United States, or not just for Israel, but for the United States as well, because those militias, there's so many of them, and they are way, way more effective than people really let on. And I think the IDF in Gaza has proven way less effective than a lot of people would have predicted going in.
Yeah, I do agree. I'm de-escalating something like that's obviously extremely important from the U.S. perspective, and not serving all of Netanyahu's interests, because it's not the U.S.'s interest. There's a lot of Israeli protests now as well because the Netanyahu approval is extremely low, and it's all being handled very poorly.
What do you think of some of the protests to block? Speaking of protests, kind of made me think of this. Yeah, these protests in the Kerem Shalom border crossing, which is on the kind of Negev desert and kind of Gaza Strip border. That there was apparently really it was almost an inspiring story. Really, all different walks of life of Israeli political spectrum coming together to block aid going into Gaza, because of course obviously it's going to go straight to the terrorists. What do you think about that, and what it says for broader, as you say, but what is so important? We both agree, kind of like stopping this violence going on here.
Yeah, I did see that. I disagree with the sentiment of blocking aid because people were held responsible for their actions on October 7th. It's just insane to hold the entirety of. I mean, that is in itself collective punishment when you start removing aid from an entire group of people because of a select few, and to see Israeli people from all different walks of life protesting. I mean, it's it's I don't know. Obviously, I disapprove of that. Um, but yeah, from their perspective, there's if the aid is going to people that aided in this attack against them, people that lost people personally, stuff like that, I could understand the sentiment of, um, making this aware and making awareness of this and protesting. But overall, I do think it's not right that the aid would be stopped.
Yeah, because again, it's just going to be it's just a situation, just same thing. It's very kind of closely related to the allegations that Israel made on the same day that they were found plausibly, found that was plausible that they could have been committed genocide by the ICJ. They come out with these allegations that 12 UNRWA staff members of the UN Relief Works Agency were involved in the October 7th attack, and now they're saying, it was as high as 10%. So they're putting this again with very unclear evidence. Apparently, they've given it to I think Western intelligence agencies, and a country that has been pretty shall we say inaccurate, to put it mildly, in the past with some of this stuff. Using that as a vehicle, it's very, very unlikely that it's very, very likely that just based on the current, funding and just how many countries have cut off aid, that UNRWA will cease to operate in February. And that really just shows you, I feel like, not just where Israel is in terms of sticking up with the Palestinians, but where the key major, Western countries like the U.S., UK, others are on the situation, which is, very, very scary, and shows, there is, let alone peace, let alone any kind of real justice for the Palestinians, but any kind of just peace for both sides, I feel like is so far off the horizon when you see just continue, denial of aid and just pushing, in my opinion, steps and steps closer to famine.
Right. Yeah. I would agree with those things.
Yeah.
Sure.
It's a very, very, very tough situation. Yeah. So it's like, what do you think? Do you think now, based on all the stuff that has happened and just has gone, just transpired, I guess, since just the continued pushing of the Palestinians from Khan Yunis down more south to Rafah, and just clearing out more and more of the border, and this growing kind of settlers movement. We saw the conference take place recently, where there was the settler leaders talking about which ways they're going to be dividing up Gaza. Do you think there is a urgent need for some sort of intervention for the Biden administration, and Israel needs to stop in some way? What course do you think the Biden administration really should be taking here, and do you think it should be kind of more like strengthened from at least the last time that we talked?
Yeah, I definitely would agree that that the U.S. sort of needs to intervene here, because the post-war plans from Israel's side seem not at all. They seem really bad. And that was sort of going into this war. You have this sort of unclear objective, which is eliminating Hamas. And I mean, the numbers that there's been numbers that the IDF has provided that say 20%, maybe more. Maybe it's like 30% of Hamas, they say, have been killed at this point. And so they say a third of all the casualties are Hamas, but there's no verifying this at this time. And I mean, just the cost. I mean, are they going to kill what? There's no way to kill 100% of Hamas. If they go for 50 or 60%, what you're going to get at 40,000 casualties. I mean, it's kind of an insane objective, and they've still failed to specify to the U.S. Time and time what their objective is, when they'll stop. And Netanyahu says it's total victory, and whatever that means. So, I mean, I would definitely agree with that messaging of total victory. I feel like
we know what that means, really.
So what would you say that means? I guess
I would say that means total victory and total control over Gaza. We've seen it from Israeli politicians. We've seen it, in some direct levels, and sometimes they'll say, we need to actually go in there and start, recreate the settlements that we had, pre-2006. But then sometimes they'll just be like, oh, we can't live with, Hamas in control. And it's like, you're going to, I think the best way, if you're actually coming at it from a smart Israeli perspective, there are tons of actually really some pretty smart Israelis that are coming out there and saying, like, we need to, there are no real super strong friends to the Palestinians, but they're just like, we need to actually provide the Palestinians with a way of, feeling like they can have a state, they can have some sort of sovereignty, even if, we're not going to give it all back, but it's like we need to have some sort of way of sovereignty. But then it's so clear. These people are like, I don't know if you know Daniel Levy, who's just like in no way, he like is a big part. He was formerly negotiated peace deals with the Palestinians in the past on behalf of the Israeli government, but now is, nowhere near the broad perspective of Israeli society, as we've talked about, throughout this past show and many other shows. But I think that, total victory is just, it really represents, total control over Gaza.
Yeah.
Like, would you agree with that?
I'm trying to think about it. I mean, I think from a lot of the Israeli government, it seems like, total victory. I mean, what does this mean with regard to, like, are they going to like occupy the region, but they can't do this with Hamas in place? So, I mean, like, optimally, the victory is eliminating Hamas, which I've said that this is sort of like an unrealistic goal. But I mean, from an Israeli perspective here, it's like, how is Israel going to keep like the current state, the status quo before October 7th, and allowing events like October 7th to occur? It's not a livable condition for either state, and especially for like Israelis who are worried about and have the intifada in their minds and the history of this. So from an Israeli perspective, there is a genuine security concern, as we know.
Mm-hmm.
And so sort of after October 7th, I mean, the Israeli population, what are they going to be happy with living here? I mean, what could you do to Gaza to make this so something like this can't happen again? And I don't agree with like what the Israeli government is pushing out now to answer that question, because I don't think it's going to come from this escalated violence. I think that you sort of have to give them hope, and you have to lift these restrictions. You have to stop checkpoints. You have to make land trades, and then when you do these things, you could give a new generation hope to like live in peace and stuff. But
I feel like you just kind of answered. Yeah, you from the Israeli perspective, I feel like you just answered your own question there.
Right. Yeah. So I don't know. It's complicated.
Yeah, I feel like when it comes to like those concessions though, as we've seen, I feel like are just not, things where the Israeli society is capable of making. And of course, that all this conversation completely ignores, again, like what the Palestinians have been going through for this, not just October 7th, which has just been unimaginable, just Gazans living in hell, West Bank under, it's important to remember, increased attack, settlers going crazier than they ever have, and it's just like, that is something that, a society that is capable. I feel like I think I said this to you in maybe like a text conversation. It's like almost reminiscent of, the Jim Crow South, like a society that is capable of democratically, as we hear, Israel is a democracy, only democracy in the Middle East. We hear it so often. A society that democratically is capable of producing such carnage like that over people that are really so close to it. They are a society that I feel like has to have some pretty, major changes in, the way that they are run, because, this is a real crime that was committed. Just like the fact that even in the best estimates by the IDF, which, in my opinion, you could essentially just toss in the trash as being, completely underestimated. But, they say 60% of the people that are killed in Gaza are civilians, but it's like, and that obviously, says that there are way many more Hamas people that are killed, but we're still, seeing missiles being fired in Tel Aviv. What was it, yesterday? So the fight against Hamas, and again, these missiles, calling them missiles are, a little bit kind of overselling it. They're just, essentially flying hunks of metal that don't really even explode. But I feel like that perspective, the fact that there really was a capital C crime, that was committed over the past 4 months. And the fact that that society is just, going to be, dictating the terms of the peace, I feel like seems to be very unstable, and is going to inherently lead to a completely wiped out Palestinian population, at least in Gaza, or B, at the very least, a very, very unjust peace where, there's some bad things that are bound to happen again down the future.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, for the way forward from this, I do. It's so hard to imagine just when you look at the map of Israel and when you just look at the like enclaves of settlements and stuff,
Mm-hmm.
just by looking at these conditions. I mean, it's so hard to imagine how in the long term it would work. Like no people there. I mean, there's ethnic conflicts like this in Africa and in the Balkans and stuff, and you see like, but never have borders been like this, and I don't think it's sustainable. So optimally, in my mind, the path forward would be a two-state solution that is temporary to the point where, because if you can't, people that propose a one state, I think it's absurd, because I think a one state is something that needs to come after a two state. I think once Israelis and Palestinians can live together side by side in two different nations, and then peace can be achieved, then there's a path forward to sort of like combining. And once the radicalization stops of people, there's a path forward to combining these territories and allowing free flow and sort of dropping these borders where both peoples can like claim this land as theirs. But I think, yeah, obviously that's an extremely far off future from what we have now. And yeah, the conditions that are going to be as a result of this war are like mind-bogglingly terrible. But also, and I sort of, just in general, this is not off topic, but in general, I kind of ebb and flow from where I place responsibility, because my gut tells me that Israel, as the powerful receiver of American aid and the powerful nation that they are, and the conditions in which they have, these occupied territories and these conditions, my gut feeling is Israel is like responsible for restoring it. And I think that's valid up until a certain point, because you get to a certain point in history and there's just not the majority. I still think Israel is definitely like very responsible for like fixing the region, but there's a certain point where I have to just put some. I go back and forth because I have to put some responsibility on not just the Palestinian side, but the Arab nations that have been telling people in Palestine that they need to fight, and they need to fight in order to like take back sort of what was taken from them in 1948. And I think that this like perspective is one of the big reasons why there hasn't been able to be peace, and not the only reason. Like there's been a lot of failures on the Israeli side, but one of the huge reasons is just this constant like feeling of having to keep fighting, and the constant urging by and backing by other Arab nations.
Yeah. Well, it was like if you're like a Palestinian and you especially are still kind of like near the area, you didn't like flee to, the US or the UK or something. It's like you are, like for example, you've been living in Gaza for the past like, you're for the past like 2 generations of your family, like ever since like 1948. Like do you really think you need like, an Arab country to like, I feel like tell you to keep fighting for your land? Like, you see the place where, your grandparents lived or your father lived, just across the other side of a fence. And I feel like that is, whether you're in the West Bank or whether you're in Gaza, you have that motivation. You don't need the Arab nations to tell you to keep fighting, because you have that motivation there. And it goes back to, I think, what we talked about, right, with providing hope for a better future for the Palestinians. And that, takes away, because if you've been at a place where, the average age in Gaza is what, like 18, it's very, very rare. You make it to like 40 years old, and death is just such a natural part of your life. Like, and just so many people that have died in a way that's just not natural for, just not acceptable for any human. It's like, that is the kind of conditions and this kind of situation that leads you to, do things like, do like suicide bombing, do things like join Hamas, like living in those kind of conditions. Like, we in the West could just not, I feel like, wrap our heads around any of that.
Yeah, I agree. But I think that there are definitely cases of people that are fighting and not being encouraged by any like external parties. Like, they're sort of fighting on their own terms because they've seen firsthand like family that's died, and they continue to see this. But that idea can't keep coming down generation after generation, that the only way to get stuff back is to fight, because just historically there.
Finish your point. Sorry.
Just like historically, there's been good deals on the table, and there's no blame for the Palestinian people here. I mean, it's just the leadership that, obviously the leadership and the people are very connected, but the leadership has had great deals, not great, but good deals on the table where, it's sort of like it would have been, I feel like, more responsible to take these deals rather than like keep fighting because we need to secure like the entirety back, when it's just not realistic. 50 years later, 40 years later.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's, this is obviously like, a very kind of common line, and I feel like this, like, we hear with the, if there's been, many, many good deals on the table, I feel like, you can go back on, which deal and why, there's various people. I think there was one of the negotiators who was, I think his name was like Shlomo Ben Ami, who I think like worked with, I don't know if it was like Rabin, who was like, if I was a Palestinian, I wouldn't take that deal. There's like, you can go through the various points in times of just like, there was one in the, I think early 2000s that was like, just messed up by, I think the Israeli far right, you could argue the Oslo Accords were really, the best chance at peace that was accepted, that was ruined by the Israeli far right, I wouldn't say really far right, but, it's been governing the country for the last, 20 years. So how really far right can it be? But, you have that, you can go, deal by deal, obviously, but also you have a climate where any sort of Palestinian, you've seen countless assassinations of, nonviolent, activists, professors, poets, things like that, all these people that have been, taken out going back decades by Israel. You have the March of Return in 2018, which is actually really what motivated me to, start being so, pro-Palestinian the way that I am, which is the fact that you had people marching from Gaza unarmed by, all independent accounts, and were shot down in their hundreds by, Israeli forces, and just clearly, going even all the way back to the, first Intifada, where you had, mass protests, general strikes, people, throwing stones at tanks that were then shot by the tanks. This has been a situation where, and again, you can talk about death going, both ways, but if you look at just the bar graph of like who's died on one side, it is not even close. Just the death of people, especially in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, has been death of just people at an extraordinarily young age. Losing people, it's left and right for the Palestinians has just been a fact of life for a long time. So I feel like the key thing is here is, I think, it's no surprise, but I would definitely agree with your first impulse that, it is more right, I guess, so to speak, to put the kind of onus on Israel. But I think the way that Israel is as a society now, almost comparison to a place like the Jim Crow South, I don't think they can be, trusted in a way to lead the, what would be quote unquote reconstruction, if that makes any sense.
Right. Okay. So, well, first about that, I mean, it's very different from the Jim Crow South. I think obviously because you're dealing with, it's not within one nation. You're dealing with like occupied territories and like technically like different peoples at war. So I think it's a pretty different situation. But yeah, I would agree though that they definitely, there needs to be other nations and the international community involved in that like
Just
post-war stuff.
Sorry, just quick.
Yeah.
Just the way I was saying with the Israel, it was the Jim Crow South, just like a society. It's obviously this is like kind of the two nations, obviously a very different thing, two different ethnic groups, obviously. But in terms of reconciliation, in terms of peace, in terms of just like coming together to a fair solution, I think it's obviously fair to say that the kind of whites of the Jim Crow South were very much kind of focused on maintaining their power. And at the expense of the black people in the Jim Crow South. I feel like that kind of impulse pervades through Israeli society, which is the comparison I was making.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I guess that would be like fair to say about like the people of Gaza. Just like yeah, that would definitely not be fair. But to go back to sort of what you're saying about that, like I think that I've heard that point about if I were a Palestinian, I wouldn't have taken that deal, that Shlomo guy. I've heard that point before. I think I think it was after the Camp David Accords or the Clinton parameters, one of those, and it was when they had one of their best deals, and I think that that quote is like taken out of context. It was more about like it was like the current state of I think in his book or something there's more context to it. It was about
but this is with the Oslo Accords though, right?
I thought that quote came after
with
Camp David.
Oh, okay, Camp David. Yeah, that's different. Yeah, okay. And I always get it mixed up because there was like so many like false start ones around the time of like the early '90s, the late '90s, and the 2000s.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know there was like. Yeah, there were like a bunch of different deals after there was like Camp David and there was Clinton parameters and there was Taba or something. So there was like a lot of I mean, I there was that one where they had the deal was like 95% of the West Bank, I think. Up as high as that much. Which I think was the one that Shlomo was referencing. But I think the quote's out of context because I think it was one of the best deals. But I do agree that, like, overall, I think the majority of the responsibilities on Israel. Like, I feel like that's very clear, and I've sort of stood by that. But I also think that it's very hard to put all that responsibility on Israel, and then have the people that they're negotiating with sort of not recognize them and not see a two-state as like a possible future. Like that that's sort of hard to work with. But yeah.
Yeah, I feel like it's like it kind of goes to like the two. My response, I guess, to that would be again kind of like the two-pronged response of just like Israel kind of in a lot of ways. We talked about we've seen in the past with like I don't know if you the Benjamin Netanyahu comments about like Hamas is our best kind of bet from the Gaza Strip because we can uplift them and say that we don't really have anyone good to work with, and then we see there's various times where the I think there was a call just various kind of assassinations of just like non-violent kind of Palestinian actors, which leads to the increasing violence visited on the Palestinians by the Israeli side is only going to lead towards, kind of just a general more, violent option. And even Hamas, they make their change in 2017 to the charter, which you could say, oh yeah, that's totally BS. They don't believe it. But I feel like the political move of changing the wording in that and kind of opening them up, obviously, to a lot of criticism from the Palestinians who are just like, there's no way should go in terms of getting a deal, is a significant gesture of saying, okay, we listen, we want to come to the table, we want to garner some kind of international support for our cause by recognizing Israel and saying that we agree with the two-state solution, clarifying that, our problems with Zionists, not Jewish people in general, things like that were like kind of changed into the Hamas Charter in 2017. But then, of course, that falls on deaf ears from the Israelis, and then you have a right kind of just the right wing government kind of continuing with the with their
Right.
settlements and things as
Well, I
they
mean,
are.
optimally they wouldn't even, view have a problem with quote unquote Zionists, because I mean, if you're living in Israel, chances are you are a Zionist, and we can't have we can't coexist if they can't coexist together in two different nations side by side if there are issues with sort of the majority of the people living there.
Yeah, I feel like the label obviously with Zionism is a very very kind of I feel like it's used by whoever in the moment on both sides to
Yeah.
kind of like say because some people would just be like, oh, Zionism just means I want all Jews to live good and happy lives, but then a lot of times that means like I want Jewish control over the state. But I feel like the key thing is I feel like when it comes down to it is making like it's pretty obvious. It should not be a controversial thing to say that Jews should live in the Holy Land if they want to live in the Holy Land. But the problem is this creation again of this kind of Jewish supremacist state where there are still you're not allowing Palestinians who have lived there prior to 1948 or were kicked out sometime after 1948 to return to those lands. And B, you're kind of having people in these different situations of the West Bank's bad, Gaza's really bad. It's a lot better for people who are Israel calls them the Israeli Arabs. But C, you also have this situation where you still have this kind of continuing movement to push things further and really structure this law. The nation state law. I know that's relatively new, but make a state that is really for Jewish people only, and not having any sort of kind of power sharing. Because again, I think the part where you make a good point is like is realistic. There's a lot of Jewish people there that have moved there, but I don't think that Jewish people should be able to live there, while enjoying more rights and enjoying more kind of a higher position than Palestinians that A, live there now, and B, have been expelled over the past period and may want to come back.
Yeah. Yeah, I do agree that Zionism sort of takes on like a ton of different definitions. And when you go back to, I mean, the establishment of Israel, within those borders, I mean, like within the partition plan and stuff, like, yeah, I wouldn't, like, I don't know if I understand the position of a lot of Jews like fleeing from Europe, and like they sort of in a lot of cases they sort of were just going with everyone else. I mean, Israel was sort of like their way out, and as soon as they got there, and as soon as independence was, as soon as they declared their independence, and you had the start of the first Arab-Israeli War, I mean, at that point, they were literally feared. They feared that what just happened to them in Europe was going to happen to them again, because they had all just migrated there. They were getting attacked on all fronts. So these fears are rational, but yeah, that doesn't justify any of, for example, any of the actions in the Nakba against like Palestinian villages and stuff. I mean, you saw that was Israel at its worst. I think it was the Nakba and a lot of the massacres during the 1948 war. But yeah.
But I feel like, again, that's like, when it comes down to that, that is really, if you think about it, you're saying that's Israel at its worst. That is like the foundation of Israel. That's like everyone in Israel celebrates that as, the day of independence, the day we got our state. That is something that's not like, they recognize as a bad thing. They just like, they're very, happy about it. And a lot of some of the leading politicians have said, we're doing Nakba too, let's go, that's like, kind of besides the point, but also not really. But yeah, continue. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's different because it wasn't like it's not an expansionist goal with, it's sort of the argument of historians with the 1948 war was whether or not they were sort of being expansionists, like strategically or not. But I think overall, you're talking about a defensive war so obviously those massacres and stuff by specific Zionist paramilitaries in early Israel, those things are inexcusable. But overall, declaring their independence, I don't think like that necessarily is Israel at its worst. I was just referring to specifically like, these paramilitary groups that were committing like really terrible things. But yeah.
Yeah, I feel like, again, like the paramilitary groups, who was David Ben-Gurion not one of, in the past, correct me if I'm wrong, like the leader of one of those groups. So it's like, He was the first prime minister of Israel. So it's like you have, that is very much, kind of looks like they were able to declare independence because they were able to, establish, obviously there was a population that was, 3%, living in throughout, from generation, millennium, has always been in the Holy Land that's been Jewish, but there's obviously been, a huge amount of migration. There's been, there was obviously some, resistance on the Palestinian side, and of course the British kind of playing, both off against the middle throughout the, the period of the 20s and the 30s and the early 40s. Yeah. But like you do have the, like for example, the King David Hotel blowing up. Like they were not, I think, to portray them as like, they were just like really, really scared. I feel like that's not really the reality situation. Like they were, very, aggressive. They knew what they wanted, and that was to, reclaim this land for Jewish people, as they were called, as they called it at the time. It was a land. What was it called? It was like a land for
Eretz.
No, it was something that was like the people. It was a land for a people without a land that also didn't have any people on it. I think that's not exactly the way the quote goes, but it's like. Yeah. It was like an early kind of Zionist saying,
Yeah. Well, so I think there's some validity to that, but also like what's important to keep in mind is like these aren't just people coming from Europe, and especially during that first Arab-Israeli war, you had pretty much an ethnic cleansing of all the Jews from the other like Arab nations, and a ton of those went to Israel, and now, half their population is Middle Eastern, Sephardic, or Mizrahi Jews. So, like, for them, that was sort of like one of their only options was going to Israel. They were sort of kicked out of all their other countries.
It was a land without a people for a people without a land was exactly the phrase of it.
Right.
Yeah. But yeah, that point that you made though, with the all the kind of Middle Eastern Jews, fleeing, and it is a very, very good point. And obviously that kind of happening in the, years following, the establishment of the Israeli state going up, through the 50s and onwards from there. And it, definitely is a very, situation where there undeniably was some kind of very, anti-Semitic attacks and very anti-Semitic impulses. But I feel like you also have to consider the fact that, these people were, inspired by the fact that, being, Jewish people, suffering from, a lot of different persecutions throughout, their history, just to see, a land that is meant for Jewish people, and they want to go there. And there's also there's been some pretty reputable instances of I think it was like Egypt, and then it was like there was also a North African country. I don't remember whether it was Morocco or Libya or Tunisia, one of those. But where the IDF and some like Mossad forces, there's some pretty solid evidence from some Israeli historians, kind of initiated events, shall we say, that would kind of motivate Jewish. Immigration towards Israel, which is, again, that's also very, very important to say. Not that there wasn't some anti-Semitic Jewish persecution there at the time, but it's like
I agree. There was pull factors from Israel, which trying to bring Jews together, like this is the land for all Jews where we could live and build and stuff. Definitely. But the majority, and especially as Israel was established, I think the vast majority of Jews living in these countries were still, they didn't want to leave. They had their homes for example, in Iraq, where in Baghdad there was hundreds of thousands of Jews, in Yemen, in these countries, this is where their family was, and a lot of them did not want to leave at first. But you had events like the Farhud in Iraq, where there were all these riots against the Jewish communities living there, and sort of it was that combination of those pull factors from Israel, and as well as those factors of them being like persecuted and stuff.
Yeah, and I feel like sorry, continue. I don't want to finish.
No.
Yeah, but I think like the basic thing, when it all comes down to that is just like, I feel like totally like Jews should be able to move to Israel, live there, but also it's just again this kind of formation of this Jewish supremacist state that is going to, make an effort to, and I feel like it was a very interesting story, and we only have, his personal accounting of it, but the father of Bella and Gigi Hadid, he tells, a few years ago talked about how he lived in Palestine in kind of the lead up to 1940, mandatory Palestine, and he recalled his family welcoming in a Jewish, family in the wake of the Holocaust, welcoming in a Jewish family into his home. And then later, come 1948, he had to eventually flee from that same area. And I feel like, it is kind of, sad because there is, and there was times, the Ottoman Empire, I'm actually happen to be learning about it at the moment, was, a relatively safe place from some of the worst anti-Semitism of Europe for a very long period of time. And it's just, they were definitely a Muslim, empire, but they were just like, we're going to put you off, different religious groups in different cantons and just like, have you do what you want to do, as opposed to the insanely Christian Europe. But, it is kind of sad because I feel like it robs the chances of, coexistence that could have happened, this push to establish kind of a Jewish supremacist state.
Yeah. Sorry. About the I guess the Jewish supremacist state, I feel like I just don't agree with this notion because I mean definitely Israeli supremacy maybe, but I wouldn't say it's any more like Jewish supremacist than America's a white supremacist state. Like I feel like many different ethnic groups like work together fine and have equal rights in Israel. And I mean, if you were to refer to Israel as a Jewish supremacist state, I feel like you got to refer to a lot of these countries that have kicked out their Jewish populations as Arab supremacist states. But yeah, I would agree with the characterization if you're saying if you have an Israeli passport, you definitely have you have supremacy in that region. You don't have to go through checkpoints and stuff.
But I feel like
I don't think it's
I feel like it's very, very hard to say like the level of security, level of kind of like equal rights in terms of like just treatment, in terms of just like how you're gonna be interact with on the street, what type of risk you are. Some places even in Israeli proper, there's still some very much discrimination for the the Israeli Arabs, as they're called, kind of living as second class citizens, especially in the wake of October 7th. Despite they of course we hear there's like there's Israeli there's Arab parties in the Knesset and stuff like that, but I feel like that is, if you ask a lot of people, I'm sure there's going to be not obviously uniformly people, you could find some people that are quite happy with the arrangements who are Israeli Arabs, but a lot of people there I feel like would say that they are not on the same footing. And you even have, the nation state law, which explicitly is saying that Israel is a state not for all its people, it kind of explicitly saying that. So, yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's, I guess the point is like, it's a Jewish state first, as in like Jews can feel safe there. That's like the first priority. So yeah, that is true. But that is also true for a ton of like Middle Eastern nations, which, are sort of like Islamic states first. I guess Iran mainly, primarily as an Islamic republic, stuff like that. But yeah, and I wanted to go back as well to what you said about anti-Semitism from Europe compared to the Ottoman Empire. Like I took a class on Sephardic Jews and learned a ton. And yeah, I mean, definitely under Ottoman rule, like that was, that there was like a golden age for a lot of the Jews living there. But in the wake of World War II, you did have a lot of Arab nations aligning with like the Axis and aligning with Germany and stuff. And so I would say
there was like a Grand Mufti or something like that. I forget the exact name of that guy. Yeah.
That guy.
Yeah.
Who like met Hitler and stuff. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, there definitely, there was definitely some very kind of, problematic people, and I'm definitely not someone who's going to, stand up for the, integrity of a lot of these, from, Mohammed bin Salman to the supreme leader, definitely people who, and I feel like they definitely, they obviously have, different motivations. Like, I think MBS's main motivation isn't necessarily to, oppress any, one group over the other. It's just to, enrich himself and, just continue to live in palaces. But then you have the, fundamentalist theocratic state of, of Iran, but both, do some pretty, tremendously bad things to, oppress their people. But I feel like, in kind of a more, within the bounds of Palestine, historic Palestine, Israel, whatever you want to call it. I feel like that the way things were going, obviously you had these kind of, formation Zionist group, but I feel like it really could have, just the point I was kind of thinking of, it was kind of very unlikely, but, kind of fantastical, historical situation like that. It certainly would have I feel like it wouldn't have been as bad a reception as people would portray. If a lot of Holocaust surviving, Jewish people moved into, mandatory Palestine without this, bent of we're going to try and start, a Jewish state for ourselves, as we saw at the expense, it's important to say, of a lot of, 500 plus Palestinian villages.
Yeah. I agree that it definitely wouldn't have been met with, that same kind of resistance, but just based on, just riots, as we talked about in the 1920s and stuff, I think it's fair to say that at a certain amount of Jewish immigration after the war, there would have been a lot of issues, but definitely, I think that you are right though with the assessment that that without that notion of like coming in and establishing a Jewish state in the area, like there could have been like a different path forward for peace, basically. Like, yeah, I would agree with that. Any ethnic nationalist sort of movement is difficult to justify.
Yeah. I think that is a very, very well said there. Yeah, this kind of structuring. I feel like we, as Americans, can definitely speak to the joys and potential, the high potential of a very multi-ethnic state. So with that being said, I feel bad because it's definitely long over the time that we said that we were going to spend on this podcast. So I do apologize for that, but hopefully you enjoy the conversation. Hopefully anyone listening to this did as well. I'm going to end it right there, and thank you so much for listening. This has been your Newsflash. We are back on Friday.